The lock on my own front door felt different that evening. I don't know how else to describe it. I'd turned that deadbolt 10,000 times over 22 years, and that night my hand hesitated. Not from fear, from something colder. Certainty. When I pushed the door open, my wife was standing in the middle of the hallway with her phone pressed to her chest, her face the color of old ash. Her brother was right behind her, arms crossed, jaw forward, wearing that expression he wore whenever he wanted to look bigger than he was. Neither of them said hello. Neither of them moved. My wife's voice came out tight and high. "What did you do with the account?" I set my jacket on the hook by the door. The same hook I'd installed the year we moved in. "I opened a new one," I said. "Moved my pension deposit and my part-time check over to it." The silence that followed had weight to it. Her brother took a step forward. "You froze us out," he said. "Not a question." "I protected myself," I replied. My wife's eyes filled, but not with sadness, with something sharper, panic. And in that moment, watching the two of them standing shoulder to shoulder in the home I had paid for, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been pulled tight for almost 3 years. Let me back up. I turned 63 in February. I spent 31 years as a pipe welder, mostly on industrial jobs, refineries, water treatment plants, the kind of work that leaves a permanent ache in your shoulders and a ringing in one ear that never fully goes away. I retired at 60 with a decent pension and enough sense to know I still needed something to do with my hands. So I took a part-time job at a building supply warehouse 2 days a week. Nothing strenuous, just inventory, some customer help, something to get me out of the house. My wife and I had been married for 11 years when her brother showed up. I'd known about him in the abstract. She talked about him the way you talk about weather in a place you used to live. He was 41, twice divorced, between things. That's the phrase she used, between things. Like he was a train pausing between stations, rather than a man who hadn't held steady employment in 4 years. Just until he gets sorted, she told me over dinner the night she asked, "You know how he is. He just needs a little runway." I did know how he was. That was exactly the problem. But I loved my wife, and love, when you've already buried one marriage, makes you willing to extend grace further than wisdom recommends. He moved into the guest room in March. By June, the runway showed no signs of ending. He was not a bad person in the loud, obvious sense. He didn't cause scenes. He didn't come home drunk. He watched television in the evenings and was polite enough at the dinner table. But there was a particular quality to his presence, a kind of frictionless entitlement that was almost invisible until you started adding up the details. The first time he asked to borrow money, it was $80. His phone bill. "I'll square you on Friday," he said. Friday passed. Then it was $150 for his truck insurance. Then $300 for what he described as a business opportunity that dissolved before I could ask what it was. Each time, my wife would catch my eye at the table and give me the small look that meant, "Please, just this once, he's family." I am not a man who struggles to say no. I spent 3 decades in trades where loose lips and easy agreements can put people in the ground. But I had a weakness, and her name was my wife's approval. I wanted to be the man she needed me to be, so I said yes. Again and again, I said yes. The suggestion about the joint account came from her, not him. That's the part I've thought about more than anything else. We were sitting on the back porch in October, maybe a year after he'd moved in. She said it the way she said most difficult things, casually, as if the idea had just occurred to her. It would simplify the household, she explained. She already handled most of the bills. My pension came in on the 1st, my warehouse check twice a month. If everything flowed into one place, she could manage it more efficiently. Something shifted in my stomach when she said it. A small, cold movement, like a drawer sliding on a bent track. But I was tired. And she looked so reasonable sitting there in the evening light with her coffee. And I thought, we're married. This is what married people do. I signed the paperwork at the credit union on a Tuesday afternoon. For the first few months, everything seemed fine. Or I told myself it seemed fine. The bills got paid, the house ran smoothly. When I asked about the balance, she had an answer ready. When I noticed the savings account had dropped, she explained it was a quarterly insurance payment. When I saw a charge I didn't recognize, it was always something plausible enough that I let it go. Her brother remained in the guest room. He started small things I noticed and filed away without confronting. A new jacket, newer boots than mine. A tablet he left on the kitchen counter that I knew we hadn't bought. When I mentioned it to my wife, she said he'd gotten a deal online and asked me not to make him feel like a house guest. He'd been there 11 months by then. The thing that finally cracked the surface wasn't dramatic. It never is. I stopped at the gas station on a Tuesday night in November. It was raining hard, the kind of sideways rain that gets in through your collar no matter what you do. I was coming back from a late shift covering for a colleague at the warehouse, cold and tired, and I needed a full tank to make it through the week. My card was declined. I stood there at the pump in the rain for a moment, certain it was a machine error. I tried again. Declined. I went inside and tried a different register. Declined. I sat in my truck for a long time after that, listening to the rain hit the roof, doing the math in my head. My pension had deposited 4 days ago. My warehouse check had come in last week. There should have been more than enough. I drove home carefully. I didn't say a word to my wife. I waited until she was asleep, and then I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and pulled up the account for the first time in months. I scrolled for a long time. The number at the top of the page didn't make sense. Then it did. Then I kept scrolling. And the picture that assembled itself line by line was not the picture of a household being carefully managed. It was the picture of a household being steadily emptied. Cash withdrawals at hours, I was asleep. Charges at restaurants I'd never been to, in towns I hadn't visited. An online sporting goods store. A hunting equipment retailer. A weekend reservation at a lodge 4 states away that I had not been invited to attend. A payment toward a personal loan in my brother-in-law's name that I had never agreed to co-sign. I looked up from the screen and stared at the wall for a while. 17 months. That was how far back the pattern went. The total, when I finally added it up, was $34,200 and some dollars, give or take. My 31 years of early mornings and calloused hands and a pension I had earned in increments of physical cost. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I drove to the credit union before work. I sat across from a woman at a desk who had the specific composure of someone who had heard similar stories before. I asked her to help me open a new individual account. I asked her to redirect my pension and my warehouse direct deposit to it. I asked her about my options. She explained everything clearly and without judgment. I thanked her and walked back out into the November air, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Footing. And that brings me back to the front door. My wife took a step toward me. "You could have talked to me first," she said. Her voice had that careful quality she used when she was trying to find the version of events that kept her in the right. "I've been talking to you for 2 years," I said. Every time I asked about the balance. Every time I asked why the savings had dropped. Every time I asked what certain charges were for, her brother shifted his weight. Those were household expenses. I looked at him. "The lodge in Tennessee," I said. "Was that a household expense?" He didn't answer. "The personal loan payment," I continued. "Was that a household expense?" My wife's eyes moved between us. "That was a one-time thing," she said quickly. "He needed it for—" "I don't need the explanation," I said. I needed to not find out this way. I walked past them into the kitchen. I needed something to do with my hands, so I filled a glass of water and stood at the counter. They followed me. Of course they did. My wife leaned against the doorframe. "You're acting like we're strangers." "I'm acting like a man who checked his bank statements." Her brother stepped around her. "You're making this into something it isn't. Nobody stole from you. Things got tight and we managed them." That word landed strangely. We. "When did this house become a we?" I asked him. "When did my pension become a we?" He opened his mouth and then closed it. My wife moved to the table and sat down. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something quieter, more careful. "Raymond," she said. "She only used my full name when she was reaching for something. We made mistakes, I know that. But you pulling out the money overnight doesn't fix it. It just punishes everyone." "I didn't pull the money out," I said. "I moved it somewhere it can't be touched without my knowledge." "That's the same thing." "No," I said. "It isn't." She looked at me for a long moment. "So what happens now?" I set the glass down. "Now I sleep on what I know. And in the morning we'll talk about what comes next." Her brother's voice went hard. "You going to kick me out? Is that what this is?" "I'm not making any decisions tonight," I said. He pointed at me. "I've been contributing to this household." "Tell me one specific way," I said. He didn't. I went to bed. I lay in the dark listening to them murmur in the kitchen below me, their voices low and urgent, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger. Not grief. Clarity. The kind that only comes when you finally stop looking away from a thing. In the morning, I made coffee and sat alone at the kitchen table with a legal pad. I wrote down what I knew. The amounts, the dates, the pattern. I wrote down what I was willing to do and what I wasn't. By the time my wife came downstairs, I had filled 2 pages. She sat across from me. Her brother stayed upstairs. That was already a change. I want to hear it, she said. Whatever you found, show me. I opened the laptop and turned it toward her. She read for a long time. The color in her face shifted. At one point, she stopped and pressed her fingers to her mouth. I watched her go through the same journey I had gone through the night before at that kitchen table, except she was doing it in daylight with me watching. When she looked up, she didn't say he didn't know. She didn't say it wasn't as bad as it looked. She said, I kept thinking we'd catch up before you noticed. That sentence told me everything I needed to know about the last 2 years. You knew, I said. She looked down at the table. You knew the whole time, I said again, not accusing, just confirming what had become obvious. I knew some of it, she said. I didn't know all of it. How much didn't you know? She was quiet for a moment. The loan, she finally said. I didn't know about the loan. Upstairs, I could hear her brother moving around, the floorboards settling under his weight in the guest room that had been his for almost 3 years. I'm going to tell you what I've decided, I said, and I want you to hear all of it before you respond. She nodded once. I've separated my income. That's done. It won't change. I paused. I'm also calling a locksmith today to rekey the house. That's not negotiable. I need to know who has access to this home and what that access is tied to. Her eyes widened slightly. Your brother has 30 days, I continued, to find a place and move out. I'll help him with 1 month of reasonable expenses if he needs it. 1 month. After that, he's on his own. She opened her mouth. Let me finish, I said. She closed it. As for us, I said, I'm not making any decision about us today, but I need you to understand that what happened isn't something I can absorb and move past quietly. I need to see that you understand what it cost. She was very still. And if I don't agree to all of that, then I think you already know what comes next. She looked out the kitchen window for a long time. The backyard was gray and bare. November had scraped it clean. Okay, she said finally. Her brother did not take the 30 days gracefully. That afternoon, he came downstairs and sat across from me at that same kitchen table like he'd been called into an office. He had a version of events prepared. He'd been working on it upstairs. I could tell because there was a shape to it, a rehearsed quality. He said the money had been borrowed, not spent. He said he'd been trying to build something. He said I'd never been supportive of him from day one. He said my wife had approved every decision, which was the most honest thing he said in the entire conversation, though he didn't intend it that way. I listened. When he finished, I said, 30 days. He stared at me. You're serious. I've never been more serious in my life. He stood up. You're going to regret treating family this way. I regret the last 3 years, I said. I'm done adding to it. He left the room, and a few minutes later I heard him on his phone, voice low and controlled, talking to someone I couldn't identify. Later I'd find out he'd called his sister. His other sister, the one I'd only met twice. That was the move I hadn't anticipated. 3 days after the conversation, my phone rang. It was my wife's mother. She was polite but pointed. She'd heard that I'd thrown her son out in the middle of winter with no warning, and she wanted to understand what had happened. I told her calmly that her son had been living in my home for nearly 3 years, that money had been withdrawn from my accounts without my knowledge or consent, and that I had given him a 30-day notice to find alternate housing. I told her I had offered to cover 1 month of transition expenses. There was a long pause. He said you'd changed all the locks and given him until the weekend, she said. I hadn't changed the locks until he'd had 5 days' notice and knew exactly what was happening. That's not accurate, I said. I'd be happy to show you the timeline in writing. Another pause. He's not in a good place, she said. I understand that, I said. I'm not trying to harm him. I'm trying to stop being harmed. She didn't have an answer for that. My wife was harder to read during those first 2 weeks. She wasn't hostile. She wasn't apologetic. She occupied the house the way a person occupies a waiting room, present but not settled, watching me from the periphery with an expression I couldn't fully translate. On the 9th night, she knocked on the bedroom door, which she'd stopped entering freely since the conversation at the kitchen table. I told her to come in. She sat on the edge of the chair in the corner, not on the bed. That detail meant something. I want to ask you something, she said. Go ahead. Are you going to ask me to leave too? I thought about that for a moment. I don't know yet, I said. That depends on some things I'm still watching. She nodded slowly. What are you watching for? Whether you're sorry, I said, or whether you're scared. She looked at me for a long time. Right now I'm both, she admitted. That's honest, I said. I can work with honest. She left without another word, and I sat there in the quiet for a while thinking about the difference between those two things, fear and remorse. They look similar from the outside. They pull the same face, but one is about consequence and the other is about understanding. I'd spent too many years accepting consequence grief as if it were the real thing. Her brother left on day 26. He carried his things out in 4 trips to a truck I didn't recognize. He didn't say goodbye. The guest room smelled like his cologne for a week after. My wife watched from the kitchen window. I don't know what she felt. I didn't ask. What I know is that the morning after he left, I woke up before the alarm and lay there listening to the house. The particular quality of silence that a house has when it's not holding something it wasn't designed to hold. I got up and made coffee and stood in the kitchen and noticed, for the first time in a long time, that the room felt like mine. I rehung a photograph that had been taken down to make room for something her brother had brought. A picture of a lake in northern Wisconsin, where I'd fished every summer for 20 years before life got loud and crowded. I put it back on the wall and stood there for a moment looking at it. Then I called a lawyer. Not because I decided anything, because I needed to understand my options. The consultation took 40 minutes. I left with a clearer picture of where I stood and what I had the right to protect. Knowledge isn't a weapon unless someone makes it one. Weeks passed. My wife and I existed in a new kind of quiet. Not hostile, not warm. Honest, maybe, in the way that stripped-down things are honest. She started paying her own credit card from her salary. I noticed that without saying anything. She stopped asking about the household balance, which told me she'd accepted that my finances were no longer an open door. Small adjustments, recalibrations. One evening, she asked if I'd told anyone what had happened. I told my brother the broad strokes, I said. No one else. She nodded. His sister called me, she said. She thinks I enabled him. What do you think? She was quiet for a moment. I think I did. That was the first time she'd said it plainly. Why? I asked. She looked out the window. Because I was afraid that if I forced him to face his life, he'd disappear. And I've spent 40 years being the person who holds the family together, and I thought that meant protecting him even when it cost me things I didn't have the right to spend. I let that sit in the room for a while. Those weren't your things to spend, I said gently. I know that, she said. I know that now. It wasn't an apology, not a complete one, but it was the first brick of something. I didn't knock it down. 2 months later, a text came from a number I didn't have saved. It took me a moment to understand it was my brother-in-law. He was brief. He said he'd gotten a job. Warehouse work, he said, which I thought said something, though I didn't know exactly what. He said he wasn't reaching out to start anything, just to say he'd heard some things from his sister that changed his understanding of the situation. I read it twice. I didn't respond that day. I went out to the garage and worked on a cabinet I'd been building from rough lumber, a project I'd started back when I first needed somewhere to put my hands. I ran the plane along the grain and thought about the text, about what it costs a person to reach towards someone they've wronged, about how hard it is to do that when the path of least resistance is to simply revise the story until you're the victim. The next day I wrote back 2 sentences. I said I appreciated him saying so, and I hoped the job worked out. He didn't reply. Maybe that was enough for both of us. Spring came the way spring does in the Midwest, all at once and without apology. I got the garden bed in shape along the back fence, the one I'd let go to weeds for 2 seasons while I was busy managing someone else's disorder. I found the tools exactly where I'd left them in the shed and stood there for a moment holding a trowel I'd owned for 20 years, thinking about the strange economy of time. My wife came out one afternoon with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the porch steps while I worked. We didn't talk much, but the quiet was different from the waiting room quiet of winter. It was companionable. I noticed that, and I let myself notice it without immediately measuring it against everything that had come before. We're not fully through it. I want to be honest about that. There are things between us that will require more time and more honesty than we've yet managed. The joint account never reopened. It won't. My finances are mine, and that boundary isn't a punishment. It's a definition. This is who I am. This is what I work for. This is where accountability lives. But I'm not ready to say the marriage is beyond repair. She is trying, in the quiet way that people try when they can't make dramatic gestures anymore. When the only option is to behave differently, day after day, until the behavior becomes the proof. I think about the man I was 3 years ago. The one who signed the paperwork at the credit union because he was tired of feeling like an outsider in his own home. The one who absorbed every vague explanation and let it go because conflict felt more dangerous than disappearance. The one who stood at a gas pump in the rain with a declined card and still found a way to not know what he knew. I am not that man anymore. I know what it costs to stop pretending. It costs comfort. It costs the version of peace that's really just suppressed conflict. It costs the relationship you thought you had and gives you back the one that's actually real. Some people will hear this story and call me cold. They'll say family is family, that you don't put a price on blood. And I would say to them, with respect, that no one put a price on anything. The price was already there. The question is just who pays it. For 3 years, the answer was me, in increments that added up to $34,000 and a level of fatigue I still don't fully have words for. I'm not angry. I want to be clear about that. Anger took too much of those years already. What I have now is something steadier, a knowledge of my own edge, of what I owe and what I don't, of the difference between generosity and surrender. If you're listening to this and you recognize something in what I've described, whether it's the slow erosion or the moment at the gas pump or the way a small compromise compounds into something you barely recognize, I want you to hear one thing clearly. You are allowed to protect what you built. Protecting yourself is not the same as abandoning anyone. It is simply the act of making sure there is still a you to come home to. Subscribe if you want to hear stories like this. We tell them here because the hardest lessons deserve to be said out loud. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Or tell me about a line you had to draw, the ones nobody applauds you for. Those are the ones worth talking about.